Think about the last time you watched a grandmaster play chess. Every move looks simple on the surface, but underneath, there are 10 layers of calculated risk, anticipated countermoves, and hidden traps. Now, imagine that chessboard isn't made of wood, but of constitutional law, executive mandates, and judicial authority.
That is precisely what landed on the steps of the Supreme Court on the 27th of June, 2025, with the landmark ruling in Trump v. CASA, Incorporated. On the surface, people saw a heated legal battle over policy and executive power. But if you strip away the political noise and analyze it through the lens of intelligence frameworks and game theory, you realize this wasn't just a legal argument. It was a masterclass in strategic signaling.
Exactly. Most news coverage just gives you the quick headlines or the emotional reactions from both sides. But we want to pull back the curtain and look at the underlying mechanics. When you apply structured analytical tools, things like Pestle, Most, SWOT, and actual game theory models, the entire decision transforms from a simple legal opinion into a complex strategic matrix.
Where most people see a sudden judicial turn, an analyst sees a long-foreseen equilibrium. Today, we are dissecting what really happened, why the players made the moves they did, and what this ruling means for the future balance of power.
Let's start macro before we zoom in. If you run a standard Pestle analysis on the environment surrounding this decision, the political and legal variables are screaming for attention. Politically, the executive branch was testing the absolute boundaries of unilateral policy implementation. Legally, the court was forced to reconcile decades of administrative precedent with an increasingly assertive doctrine of judicial review.
And don't overlook the economic and social dimensions in that Pestle equation. When a government shifts policy at a foundational level, industries react, compliance costs swing wildly, and civil society organizations like CASA, Incorporated, mobilize immediately. CASA wasn't just litigating a specific rule. They were defending an entire operational ecosystem built around predictable legal standards.
Which brings us right into the Most analysis mission: objectives, strategies, and tactics. If you look at the executive branch's mission, it was maximum speed and structural transformation. Their strategy was aggressive implementation, using rapid administrative actions to create facts on the ground before the courts could intervene.
But their tactic encountered a classic structural bottleneck. CASA's strategy, on the other hand, was defensive containment. Their objective wasn't necessarily to win every single policy debate in the court of public opinion, but to force the conflict into a forum where procedural precision outweighs executive momentum. They used nationwide injunctions and statutory challenges as precise tactical levers to halt that momentum dead in its tracks.
It really highlights the asymmetry of the battle. If we look at this through a spear framework examining the social, political, economic, academic, and regulatory forces, the legal arguments were anchored in deep regulatory shifts. But academically and socially, the friction was about institutional legitimacy. Who gets the final word when executive urgency collides with statutory constraints?
And that brings us to the SWOT breakdown. For the executive side, their greatest strength was the speed of unilateral action and a unified administrative apparatus. Their threat, however, was always judicial overreach arguments that could unite both liberal and conservative institutionalists on the bench. CASA's strength lay in standing and procedural equities, but their weakness was the vulnerability of relying on broad judicial remedies in an era where the High Court is actively narrowing those remedies.
Speaking of analyzing complex systems, taking a step back to understand the broader context is essential whether you are examining landmark court decisions or analyzing global security dynamics. That's why podcasts like ours exist, to break down these dense topics into clear insights.
Absolutely. The New Sentinel is a podcast dedicated to providing in-depth discussions and deep dives into a wide array of topics. From the glitz and glamour of pop culture to the strategic intricacies of military operations, we cover it all. Each episode is thoughtfully crafted to offer listeners a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter, featuring expert interviews, detailed analysis, and engaging storytelling.
Whether you're a pop culture enthusiast or someone with a keen interest in global security, the New Sentinel has something for everyone. Tune in, view, subscribe, and comment to stay informed and entertained. And if you are an entrepreneur, we can help you advertise your product or service to an engaged, curious audience.
Now, turning back to the strategic core of Trump v. CASA, Incorporated, this is where game theory unlocks the true logic of the Supreme Court's June 27th ruling. If you treat the executive branch and the judiciary as two rational players in a non-zero-sum game, the incentives become strikingly clear.
Think of it like a classic strategic hawk-dove game or a modified prisoner's dilemma. The executive plays a high-risk strategy. Push authority to the absolute maximum. If the court yields, the executive gains a massive payout in policy control. If the court strikes it down entirely, the executive takes a loss, but can still score political points by blaming judicial activism.
Right, but look at the court's payoff matrix. The Supreme Court's primary institutional goal is preserving its own authority and legitimacy. If the court approves every executive action, it risks becoming perceived as a stamp for executive power. If it strikes down every action, it risks an institutional showdown that could spark calls for court reform or non-compliance.
So what is the Nash equilibrium in that scenario? The point where neither player can unilaterally change their strategy without getting a worse outcome.
The Nash equilibrium was precisely the narrow, highly technical ruling we saw on June 27th. The court didn't completely invalidate the executive's policy ambitions, nor did it give a blank check. Instead, it dismantled the procedural mechanism CASA relied upon, specifically limiting the scope of nationwide preliminary injunctions while simultaneously signaling strict boundaries on executive statutory interpretation.
That is brilliant. By restricting nationwide injunctions, the court protected executive efficiency in the short term, giving the administration a tactical win. But by reasserting its sole authority to interpret the underlying statute, the court retained ultimate veto power over future policy expansions. It recentered the balance of power squarely back onto the judiciary.
It's classic tit-for-tat signaling. The court effectively told the executive branch, you can move fast, but you cannot bypass statutory boundaries. And it told advocacy groups like CASA, you can challenge administrative rules, but you cannot use a single district judge to freeze national policy indefinitely. Both sides received a partial payoff, but both were forced back into a constrained strategic corridor.
It shows how legal outcomes are rarely just about abstract principles of justice in a vacuum. They are about institutional survival, deterrence, and managing long-term incentives. When you map out the strategies like that, the June 27 ruling wasn't an arbitrary compromise, it was a calculated stabilization of system dynamics.
Exactly. And that raises a fascinating philosophical question for the future. If judicial rulings are increasingly shaped by strategic game dynamics between branches of government, what happens to predictability for ordinary citizens and businesses attempting to navigate the law?
When the rules of the game are constantly being recalibrated by high-stakes strategic play, stability becomes fragile. Every precedent is no longer just a rule. It becomes a positional play for the next conflict.
Which leaves us wondering, as executive power continues to test its limits and the courts refine their defensive countermeasures, are we moving toward a more resilient constitutional balance, or are we simply escalating the complexity of the game until the board itself breaks?
That is the ultimate question hanging over the aftermath of Trump v. CASA Incorporated. The ruling settled the dispute of today, but it set the stage for an even more intricate game tomorrow. Thank you for walking through this analytical deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the headlines, look for the underlying incentives, and we will see you next time on the New Sentinel.